تفضل استاذ
Thank you.
We're
So,
speaking about
okay. Yeah. I mean, it's. I'm sorry, I'm not an expert on the very specific topics you'll be talking about today. But before I speak, I would like to thank the university for inviting me to speak, especially Dr. Feather, whom I've known for a while, and also the administration of the university, Dr. Kedi. Our campus is in Tangier, by the way. We established the first campus in Morocco in Tangier, and the name of our street is Abu Sa'id Bukeri. So just so you know, we share that in common. I just before I came here today, I take a quick ride in the old Medina, the Portuguese side of El Jadida. Reminds me of the interesting ways in which cities change, and I'm sure you'll be talking about cultures and languages. Tangier also was occupied by the Portuguese about more or less the same time that El Jadida was. And of course, when the Portuguese left in the middle of the 17th century, the city was handed down to England, which occupied my native city, which is of Tangier. So the British stayed there for a while, and then they were forced out by Moulay, one of the famous kings of Morocco, Moulay Ismail. But it was a very interesting history. So there's this accumulation of languages and histories that stay with us, sometimes not so consciously, but they're there. And they remind us of the overlapping and palimpsest sort of cultural heritage that we've all inherited. I don't have anything specific to say. I have a few reflections to make. And then I'm hoping that at the end of my talk, there'll be a few questions, and maybe we can elaborate on those as you see fit. The one item that I've been thinking about recently in the last few years is the relationship of language to culture. Well, I've done this for a while, as Abdul Qadir knows. In my earlier work, I talked about language and African literature and identity issues. They are always related. But if you look at let's say in the case of contemporary Morocco, there is an interesting debate happening right now about a national language. Morocco is one of the few places, I think, one of the few places, but at least it's an outstanding example of a nation that doesn't seem to have settled on a national language. There's no, Moroccans are very good at speaking French. Moroccans are very good at speaking classical Arabic. Moroccans are even good at speaking English and Spanish, but they doesn't seem to be able to speak and write using the same language. The language they speak at home or in the cafes or in the public markets is not the language they use to express themselves in poetry and literature and art. It's a very tense debate in the country right now, but it's worth keeping that in mind as you explore the relationship between cultures and languages. And of course, when you talk about culture and languages, you're talking also to some extent, and maybe to a large extent, about religion. And religion has a big impact on how people perceive themselves and their cultural relations. So, for example, in the case of Arabic, classical Arabic, that is now the official language from Mauritania all the way to Iraq and so on, that language came to this part of the world from what's more or less called the Arabian Peninsula, maybe the Middle East, which is parts of Syria and southern Iraq and maybe northern Arabia. That's where the Arabic language seemed to have originated, even though there are versions of it in Yemen and other places. And it came related. It was embedded. It came embedded in the religion of Islam. So to be able to separate the two languages, to tease out Arabic from the religion, would be a very tricky thing to do. And it's similar to the question that happened in medieval late Middle Ages, or maybe the early modern period in Europe, which is to say, the removing Latin, which was the official language of the church, and from the daily languages of the people, the vernaculars, which eventually evolved to become the national languages of a lot of nations, Italy, Spain, France, and other nations, and now these nations have their own national languages, and Latin has become practically a dead language. My children take Latin in the United States, but it's a huge exception in most cases. So how does, and now, I mean, there's a question we'll come back to later, the question of English. As you probably know, and I've been paying attention, and some people have been paying attention, the esteemed Minister of Higher Education in Morocco is now warning all the scientists, people who are doing scientific research. They're saying if you don't use English in next year, you'll be out of a job, and maybe you won't get the grants. You won't be getting the grants and the resources to do things. He's practically saying or implying that French is wishfully, probably more than wishfully, that French is dead. But it's not dead in Morocco. It will have a very long life in Morocco, and despite all the attempts to extricate it from the body politic or the body cultural, if you will, of this nation, because there are too many complications for that. But be that as it may, there is a conscious attempt, at least expressed openly now, that English would be a better language for Morocco and Moroccans as a foreign language. As for a national language, as I said, it's up in the air. We don't know exactly in what direction that discussion will go. The different, which side will have the upper hand in the end, whether it's the classical Arabic side or the Darija side, which is a very interesting option. If it's the Darija, which is the dialect of Morocco, the vernacular of Morocco, it has many variations too. The Darija I speak in Tangier, it's not the Darija people speak in Jadida, and it's not the one that's spoken in Marrakesh. So that's another variation. But that's the history of languages. There has never been one language. And language, like culture, and remember Samuel Huntington's famous thesis, The Clash of Civilizations, always comes with a certain amount of violence. There's no nation that has adopted one uniform language or just a uniform identity or a uniform religion without a good amount of violence. In other words, languages, religions, ideologies are very often imposed on the indigenous people violently. And eventually, over time, they get adopted and they become part of their identity. So, which language, which cultural trend will end up being the dominant one is something to be determined. Now the other thing is, and as I presented the case to Abdul Qadir, is like now in our fields of cultural studies, post-colonial studies, of course we know some of us started doing this kind of work in the heyday of Edward Said and Homi Bhabha and even when Michel Foucault was alive and kicking and all that stuff. But now I think things have changed tremendously. We were still talking, maybe coming out of a Marxist matrix. Maybe we were thinking, we just came out of a very strong progressive movement in colleges and universities. We were very sensitive, maybe allergic to notions of Western hegemony. And that's because we are just maybe the first or second generation of scholars who grew up in independence, and we were very wary of European and American domination, especially. And even though paradoxically, and we still continue to do so paradoxically, we spoke in their languages, we borrowed their theories, we relied on their critical analysis to make sense of our own relationship to them. In other words, there is a certain amount of contradiction in the work that is involved in cultural criticism, but nevertheless, that's how we did it. And that's how we continue to do it. Edward Said, as you know, who is very famous, still famous in many parts of the world, even though he's been dead for a while, he wrestled furiously with the West. He countered the Western hegemonic practices, but using every Western tool at his disposal. He was more Western than most Westerners, He was more American than most Americans, and yet he was railing against the West for having done a lot of injury to parts of the Middle East, especially Palestine, and so on. So there's an interesting case in history. He's an interesting case of an intellectual, and I wrote about this in the earlier part of my scholarship, as somebody who is criticizing the West, but at the same time being more Western than most Westerners. He's adopted very warmly by a lot of people in the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America, but they don't very often. These people do not have his cultural background, so they take his what they think is his anti-Western stances from his work, but in reality, he was more complex than that. What the reality now is, but that age of post-colonialism is practically dead. I think that generation, when I started doing this work, that notion was very alive and very powerful. In the span of 2 decades or less, I think that is gone. I just came back from a conference in Marrakesh in the World Forum on Human Rights, which brought together about 5,000, 7,000 people from around the globe. We talked about human rights, and I was in a panel about religious traditions and human rights. And then one of the panelists, I wasn't in the panel, I was in the audience. One of the panelists said, as a French, he's a Frenchman who is the head of a human rights organization in France, in response to a lot of Moroccan people in the audience who were saying, you're imposing your European ways on us, and you are having, you're imposing your agenda on us, your liberal agenda on what is practically a Muslim nation, and so on. He said, he looked at them in some degree of exasperation, and he said, Europe is dead. There's no more Europe. I mean, the idea that Europe still has that kind of imaginary power that people think it has doesn't exist anymore. And he's right. I just read an article recently that China is now the world superpower. China, which is the embodiment of the East and Third World peoples fighting Western domination, now is a maritime superpower. It is contending with the United States, and it's in a matter of maybe years, if not in the next decade, will emerge as the hegemonic power of the globe. Now it's up to us to decide then what to do with China, and then after that, Russia, Brazil, and other nations that may come in its wake. So the geography of hegemony, if you will, the map of hegemonic practices. The West has long ceased to be a geographic entity, as you know. There is no such thing as the West. The West is a pure fiction. Just, if I may dare say this, there is no such thing as an Ummah. There is no such thing as an Arab nation. There is no such thing as a Europe. There is no such. There's a huge category that embody huge, complex realities, and they're very diverse. They're very contradictory. They live in a tremendous amount of tension. But we continue to use them in our work as if they mattered, as if they made sense. And you need a microscopic tool to look at these very things and see whether they do make sense. If you look, people have said, some scholars have said, there is no Mexico. And I tell people in the United States, well, I can explain what I mean later. In the United States, when the President of the United States stands in a podium like this and addresses the American people, he says, American people, or any politician says the same thing. I say there's no American people. It doesn't exist. American people, they don't exist. It's a fiction. It's a trope. It's something politicians use to try to persuade people. I mean, there are 25, maybe 35 million Americans right now. Nobody knows exactly what these people are thinking. People just use that expression to give the illusion that they are in touch with the American people. So we often use these very broad categories that do not make a lot of scientific sense. They do not make a lot of scientific sense if they make any sense at all. And then we begin to base our theories on them. The West has long ceased to be a geographic entity, and we will be wasting our time if we continue to resist the West as we discuss issues related to languages and cultures. I'm in the process of reading a book that's very interesting. It's called The Second Machine Age. Just been published And I took I just out a few notes just to remind myself of things that are saying. If you look what these guys have done, they show a map they show a graph of world history from the beginning to now. And if you look, if you go to the Stone Age and the industrial and the agricultural, the invention of agriculture and so on, the graph of innovation is pretty flat. It goes like, it keeps going flat, 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 and then all of a sudden it spikes out when it hits the Industrial Revolution. Something huge happens with the industry. For the first time in human history, muscle power has been replaced by mechanical power. And when you do that, then the sky is the limit. You can multiply that mechanical power by as much as you want to. And then what happened between the Industrial Revolution to now was a huge jump in human development. Everything that you see today in this room almost everything. I'll come to the second part. Is a product of the Industrial Revolution. And then he said, now we are living in the second machine age, he said in this book, and which is now the digital revolution, this kind of stuff. What it means now, there's no telling where we're going to be going with this. In other words, it's still in its infancy. We don't know the effects of this. When electricity was invented in the late 19th century, it took about 3 or 4 decades for it to make a difference. In the first decade or two, there was no appreciable difference in the business practices, or even in business management. People were still using the power of steam as an assumption in their business practices. But eventually, electricity changed the nature of work and electricity, and now even daily shifts, and everything changed as a result of that. We are still at the infancy of that. And what is happening then, and as jealous as we might be of our cultural heritage, as defensive as we might be about our identities, we are not producing much of anything to participate in this dynamic that I just mentioned. We are consumers. We may build the highest skyscrapers in the world, but somebody else's technology is doing it for us. We might be driving the best Mercedes in town, but somebody else is having that. So it goes. There is something seriously problematic in our nation and civilizations, and it cannot be addressed by mere, chest pounding and saying, "Great, we are the best." We need to do something to become part. And does language and culture play a part in this? I think they do, and I think we should jump into that debate with some sort of seriousness. I was talking yesterday. I told Abqa that I couldn't stay in the hotel. I had to meet somebody else. He was the guy who conducted the poll that was published in Telkel about Moroccan attitudes and beliefs. He came to see him from Casablanca. He's the head of a big polling agency in Casablanca. It's like the Gallup of Morocco, so to speak. And we're discussing the findings, and we're talking about, and we decided, two of us, it's no, you can be, like Abdullah Al-Awi, the great Moroccan historian, said a few decades ago, Moroccans are alienated between tradition and modernity and the West. They're somewhere lost in the middle. It's like, there are people who cling on to some notion of tradition, and some people who live in a world of simulacrum of the European, French, Western, whatever tradition, and meanwhile there's nothing happening in the middle. In other words, there's no patriotism. The interesting finding that poll was Moroccans identify first and foremost as Muslims before they do as Moroccan, and then what the interesting thing, and the elite of this nation think they're more French than Moroccan, or something to this effect. But nobody is speaking the language of the masses, and neither one of them is probably sending their kids to public school. How many people send their children nowadays to public school? Everybody is sending their children to private schools. And if people do not send their children to public schools, especially the rich people and the elites, they cannot be patriotic. They wouldn't be invested in the public educational system, and therefore they are abandoning the national project of development. They just care about their well-being. So what's lacking, the finding of the discussion I had last night with this gentleman, is that patriotism is lacking. We are sort of dazzled by abstractions. Islamic community, European civilization, great concepts, but nobody's picking up the trash from the floor. Nobody is sending their kids to the public school. And that is the problem. We need a language that not only allows us to give justice to our memory and history, but allows us to jump on the bandwagon of progress and civilization and get rid of those nostalgic notions of oppression and injustice and so on, and become producers of our own civilization, and especially for our nations. And in this case, for Moroccans, Morocco, for Algerians, Algeria, for Tunisians, for Danes, Denmark, and so on. And I will stop here and I'll see if you have any questions. Thank you. I'm sort of convinced of this. I mean, again, it's like, what's the expression? You cannot swim in the same river twice. It's the water changes and it's not the same water. Same thing with culture. There's no such thing as, when we speak about culture and heritage, I mean, just as if I know we may not be doing this consciously, but there's something in the back of our minds that seems to be assuming that culture is a dead thing. That whatever happened in the 7th century was frozen and sealed for the rest of time, or whatever it is. But culture is like a river. It keeps changing. It's never the same water. It's never the same. It ebbs and flows, and sometimes it floods, like recently it did in some parts of Morocco. So it's like, it's a moving thing. It's a moving target. It's never the same thing. So the example you gave of a woman's dress right now in Morocco, the way with the scarf and the jeans, very interesting. It's like, but then there are all kinds of variations on that. And I'm not so sure whether the scarf has become a fashion item or a statement of religiosity or a cultural statement. I'm not so sure. I spend almost every morning when I'm in Tangier, I go to a cafe in my neighborhood, and about 60% of the women who come to that cafe are wearing the niqab. And they go upstairs, they have great conversations, they're always talking, they spend 2 hours talking. And one day when I came close enough, I realized they were all speaking in French. So here I am, assuming that these people were like very conservative Moroccans living, and they are all from France. And meanwhile, the local Moroccan women are dressed like this, like you. There was nothing. So it's interesting. So in France, what I got from that is in France, they're becoming stricter Islamic than we in Morocco.